Hello and welcome to another episode of the Faces podcast brought to you by Earth Refuge, the world's first legal think tank dedicated to climate migration. My name is Ella Kiyomi Dobson and I am one of the correspondents for Earth Refuge. Today I'm delighted to introduce to you Jordan Hartzell, one of the founding members of the Farmlink Project. The Farmlink Project is an organization combating issues of food insecurity and food waste through connecting farmers to food banks to deliver millions of pounds of fresh produce that would otherwise be wasted. Jordan is a current senior at Brown University and has been a pivotal member of the Farmlink Project since its inception in the spring of 2020, and has moved through a few different roles within the organization, but I will let her speak to those in a minute. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Jordan. How are you doing?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm well, how are you?
Good, thank you. So firstly, could you tell us a bit about your background and where you call home?
Sure. So I'm from Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, which is a small town in the middle of the state. It's about 3 hours from both of the major cities on both sides. In a fairly agricultural community, though I didn't know that until I had started with Farmlink. And so that aside, that's my hometown. But my background is that I study applied math computer science at Brown, though it's been a bit of a winding path to get here. So I've tried my hands at a couple of different things, and I'm still kind of figuring out exactly what I want to do. But that's where we are now.
Could you provide our listeners with a little more information about the Farmlink Project and your role or roles within the organization?
Certainly, yeah. So the Farmlink Project is a nonprofit that was started in April of 2020. And at that point, in the midst of the pandemic, large-scale supply chains broke down because places like restaurants, cafeterias, food courts weren't ordering bulk sizes of food and specifically of produce. So if you can imagine, 3-gallon bags of milk, there's no kind of ability for a consumer to take that in their fridge. And so quantities like that were sitting around in warehouses and early on in the supply chain, so closer to the farm side than to people's tables, without any demand from industries that had shut down with the pandemic. And then on the flip side of that, there were more folks relying on food assistance programs than had before. As jobs were being lost, there was scarcity of food availability as people hoarded things. And so we had this kind of dual problem, one of oversupply and one of over demand. And so we thought that it would be useful and possible to connect the supply with the demand. And so in that spring and throughout the summer, we arranged the logistics for the connection of produce from the farm side to food banks across the United States. And we started small. It was just, calling farmers individually, asking them if we could buy their produce with capital that was raised from individual donations. And our goal at that point was to inject capital back into the agricultural supply chain and keep farmers and truckers employed during that time while getting food to people's tables. But as we continue to grow and got this process of kind of transportation and logistical connections into more and more states, we realized that the model was extensible, and also that as the conditions of the pandemic changed, it was a problem that wasn't constrained. Also, apologies because here too. But the problem isn't constrained to the particular situation of the pandemic. And what I mean by that is there's food waste throughout the agricultural supply chain. And I say waste because specifically there's food that would be going to a landfill or other options further down the supply chain when it could be feeding people at what we think could be lower cost. So as we grew, we changed our model a little bit to be more kind of more adaptable to non-pandemic conditions. So more donated food, more sponsored trucking, and we've been able to get millions of pounds of food across the country in that way.
And where did your work originate? Like, where did you start? And I'm assuming now you kind of work across the US and in Mexico too?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So where did you start and how have you grown since then?
Yeah, so we started in LA. This is where some of the founding members call home, and so they had volunteered with their local food bank for years throughout their adolescence, and they decided that, you know, with increased demand at that location as well, that they could get produce to this place because they knew the folks who were running it. And the very first delivery, there were kind of two deliveries. One was of eggs and one was of onions. And specifically for the case of onions, they came out of Washington, and the founders, you know, called up a farmer, finally got a yes that we could purchase their produce, and then paid extra to have the truck routed rather than going back to the field to dump the onions for waste, had it routed to a food bank where there were volunteers ready to unload it and get those onions out to folks.
Very cool.
Then we've, you know, gone to, I think I may be incorrect in this number, but I think we're at 48 states. And so it's been interesting to see that model and its different permutations in different communities.
Yeah, you mentioned in your bio that one of your roles has been in creating a sustainable model for rescuing surplus produce. Could you tell us a bit more about what this model looks like?
Certainly. Yeah. So my main role over the last 6 months, and I will say as a bit of a caveat that I've stepped back a bit as I've transitioned back to undergraduate life. So there are other folks taking on this work at the moment, but my main role has been on our product team. And the product team was formed to help create, as you mentioned, a sustainable business model, and to support that sustainable business model with a tech tool. And I'm using air quotes to describe tech tool because what we wanted to avoid was building an overcomplicated piece of software technology and then coming into a space that has been working for a very long time and say, you know, we know how to fix it with this piece of tech, you should use it. Because folks are doing that to farmers all the time. And so we are cognizant that, you know, relationships come first, need finding comes first, identifying ways that people want to work within their spaces comes first. And so we spent all of this time doing what amounted to product research by setting up a completely manual process of buying food, negotiating the price, you know, doing all of the checks that the packaging and safety and transportation would work. But then we got to a point where we realized that we needed to be able to scale the amount of food we moved, but we couldn't afford to scale the cost of that food, nor we could scale neither the cost of that food nor the labor required to transport that food, especially given that the labor was coming from volunteers, and we wanted to make sure that there were no errors and that, you know, folks could do this sustainably. So the first few months of running the product team in 2021 consisted of talking to a bunch of farmers and folks at food banks and people throughout the agricultural supply chain, you know, at restaurants and grocery stores, and then all the way back to the farm level. And what we realized was that we needed a way to be able to make the connection from farm to food bank seamless. So for the Farmlink team, what that meant was making a quicker match between farm and food bank based on parameters that we know that our volunteers are using to determine what food bank should take what produce. So for instance, what a food bank has asked for in the past, what their capacity is for unloading, their operating hours, the last time that we worked with them. And our goal is to build out this, I keep using the word sustainable here, but to build out this more long-lasting plan for moving food where we don't scale the money and cost involved by automating some of the steps that are completed by volunteers. We hope eventually too that we can bring kind of some more, I want to say complicated, but not so much complicated as like more deeply rooted in the way that farmers work. You know, some ways of making it easier for people to donate food, making it easier for people to work with Farmlink, helping people understand what their options are in terms of tax deductions and credits when they donate fresh food, et cetera. So.
Amazing. I think it's really impressive how you work across the entire food chain, not just certain parts of it. what inspired you to get involved in combating the crises of food insecurity and food waste?
Yeah, so I fell into Farmlink on accident. And a friend, so Will Collier, who graduated from Brown in 2020 during the pandemic, he brought up that he was working on this project and working to transport food from farms to food banks. And I thought it was really interesting and kind of lazily offered to help build the website since I studied computer science, kind of hoping that maybe that could be a foot in the door for me. So I started coming to their group meetings, which, at the time we didn't have Teams. It was just kind of a bunch of people on a Zoom call trying to figure things out. They had already moved a couple loads of food by then, but they wanted to make sure the website would reflect that. So I did a little bit of JavaScript injection and a Squarespace site, and then just kept bugging them to come to meetings until I was on the calendar regularly. And then from there, I became enthralled by the idea that my decisions and my input could change people's experience of the pandemic, and could also perhaps change the way that they thought about food. And that latter point comes from bringing more volunteers onto the Farmlink Project. It's certainly been the case for me that working throughout, thinking about the supply chain and thinking about the food system, and all of the different things that go into figuring out how food gets to the grocery store, how it's priced, all of that has really changed my perspective. And so another thing that was enthralling along with seeing Farmlink's kind of direct impact on communities that receive food was also seeing the impact that Farmlink had on the people who were getting involved.
Amazing. It's a pretty inspiring process that you have all gone through in the last, I guess, year and a half. And as someone working on the ground and even the organization, do you get any support from other organizations, local communities, or the government?
Yeah, totally. So Farmlink would not have been anything without supporting organizations in individual communities that are receiving food, in communities that kind of cradle the growers that supply food, but specifically food finders coming out of California. Out of Los Alamitos specifically, they were our fiscal sponsor for the first year plus of Farmlink's lifetime. So they dealt with countless situations, I guess, becoming to a young nonprofit, and did so with such grace and patience. And in terms of government grants, I actually don't know the answer to that. I'm a little bit further away from some of our grant processes, but on the product team, we were specifically funded by the Kroger Co. Zero Hunger, Zero Waste Foundation, and worked with IDEO and World Wildlife Fund on an accelerator project back in spring. So those partnerships I'm have a lot more information about, but all communities that have received Farmlink food have done so with the leadership of community organizations. And so Farmlink really shouldn't, I guess I should say, Farmlink would not be able to get food to communities if it weren't for people within communities knowing the needs of their neighbors, knowing the capacities of their neighbors to lean on one another and organize together. And that's something that I think Farmlink wants to continue to foster, is giving communities the ability to say what they need and say how they think Farmlink should work within their space.
Cool. Thank you for sharing a bit of background about Farmlink. So you've touched on how it sort of started from pandemic-related food waste and food problems, but just moving track slightly, how do you think the issues impacting food security are related to climate change?
Yeah, so they are intimately intertwined, and I didn't realize that until I started work. I think I had pretty limited exposure to the idea of food waste. There's a fact that is kind of a flashy one in articles about food waste that says that food waste would be the third largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions if it were a country. So behind two other countries, the third country is food waste. And so not only is food waste throughout the agricultural supply chain a huge issue, but the kind of general operation of the food system right now is not built to incentivize production at the level of demand. And so what I mean by that is overproduction is baked into the planning of agricultural output in order to provide protection to farmers, which is necessary given the whims of weather and the produce market and a bunch of other factors. But some of, I guess I could outline some of the ways that that food waste contributes to long-term climate issues. One is land use, and another would be leaving food in the ground. And so this is the one that I'm most familiar with, so I can talk a little bit about that. But as food moves throughout the supply chain, it acquires more money from labor costs, from planning costs, and then also just labor costs as it goes down the supply chain. So at the beginning, because it hasn't been harvested yet, and because it hasn't been processed or packed, there's less water, there's less labor, there's less money involved in each particular unit of produce than when it's packaged or even just pulled out of the ground. And so if any produce is going to go to waste, it makes the most sense for it to go to waste at the beginning of the supply chain. And so generally, if there's overproduction or oversupply, food will be left in the ground because that saves farmers money, and it saves the environmental costs of processing food that may not have demand when it gets to market. And so one environmental factor that you can do is that there's land being used for food that's not always harvested, or there are environmental resources that go into food that isn't always harvested. So that's one that we've had our eyes on. But just food waste in general is a big contributor to greenhouse gas, not just because of food in the ground, but another one you could point to is food in landfills, which emits methane. So a couple different ways in which the food system is a contributor to climate change, but there's certainly a lot of room for growth.
Yeah, and I guess we've seen this kind of drastic shift, particularly in the last few months or last few years, of intensified wildfires and droughts and floods. Has there been any difficulty adapting to that, particularly since you guys started, or is this not something that you've really experienced?
So it's not something that that I think we've experienced with the Farmlink Project, though we have talked to some farmers who have had to start strategizing specifically on the West Coast because of the changing level of the water table and just lack of accessibility to water. So not something that we've dealt with in the sense that it hasn't affected our logistical protocols. It hasn't necessarily changed who we work with, but we can see a future in which it will, given that some of our direct relationships may change their output or change their crop type or change their operational areas.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And what do you think could be done by either the public or through governance that would make your job and the work of Farmlink easier?
Oh, that's a good question. So we have I'm going to defer, but we have a policy team at the Farmlink Project whose whole functionality surrounds the question that you're talking about. So how specifically can the government do better in the name of the food system, and specifically in feeding people in a way that will ensure that people can afford fresh, healthy produce at regular intervals in ways that fits well with their lifestyle, and is culturally sensitive. And then secondly, how can they do that in a way that doesn't generate waste and is respectful of all of the workers throughout the entire process. And I will say that the public participating in the effort to mitigate food waste, the first is just mitigating food waste in your own life, like just kind of starting to think about portioning in a way that keeps you from throwing food out. I think when I started working with the Farmlink Project, I almost immediately realized how much food waste I personally make. Another one would be to lower your standards as a consumer for what types of produce you eat. And so I don't mean, you have to eat the rotten stuff in the name of climate justice, but don't be afraid of things that are bumpy and wonky looking in the grocery store, because other people aren't selecting those and those are going to waste. So being able to do your part in making sure that things in the grocery store don't go into the trash after hours is a good thing. But then specifically Farmlink oriented, we always have several hours a week where folks can join members of the Farmlink Project and call farmers and actually volunteer directly by learning about the agriculture practices either in their community, by talking to farmers and asking about whether they have any surplus. They can talk to members of the Farmlink Project about joining the team, and we have kind of regular intervals of applications. So there's always ways to get directly involved with Farmlink, but a good start is changing your practices of generating food waste in your own life, and then volunteering at any food pantry or food bank when you can.
I think that's a really important thing to be reminded of, is sort of personal habits and how we can individually impact the climate or mitigate the climate crisis in small ways. I guess to follow on from that, in your opinion, do you think enough is being done to combat food waste and food insecurity, and particularly climate change induced food insecurity, which maybe your work isn't particularly involved in, but
yeah, I don't think there's enough being done. And I guess this is coming from somebody who does not have the background of some folks on the policy team, but just from my experience early on in the pandemic, when relief programs were sponsoring, bringing produce from farms directly to families. And I'm talking about the Farmers to Families Food Box program that the USDA sponsored. This was really well received by a lot of folks who had access to mixed produce that was large enough for their family, and easily accessible. And so if programs, I don't want to necessarily say that program is the be all end all and can fix everything throughout the food system, but just seeing the ways in which being creative in a time of extreme need can really pay off and change people's experiences of a crisis, that really makes me believe that there are even more creative things that we can do to mitigate what is slowly but very surely another crisis, just at a different scale and operating in a different kind of way, which is the climate crisis. And so again, I'm not sure exactly what kinds of policies will mitigate the food insecurity that comes out of changes to the food system that happen on a longer time scale. But I do know that the government has changed people's relationship to their food in times of crisis, and will need to do it again. And in my opinion, hasn't gotten it off the ground yet.
Mm-hmm. And again, I know that the Farmlink Project is mainly working on the food waste and delivering produce to food bank side, but I think it is worth touching on the intersection between food insecurity and climate change induced displacement, which is an area that Earth Refuge has a big focus in. And there's increasing vulnerabilities from, for example, the increase in extreme weather events that we spoke to a bit earlier. Have you or any of your team members sort of spoken about that intersection and seeing these shifts in the US particularly?
Yes, definitely. So there are a couple, we've actually had to form a crisis response team on Farmlink, because even just in we started as a crisis organization and then actually had to form another crisis group within it as the first crisis became less crisisy. And that was primarily because, when heat was out in Texas, and then when folks were displaced by Hurricane Ida, like there was a huge amount of food insecurity that occurred because actual kind of individual safety had to take the forefront. And so not only were people no longer able to access food, but they were unsafe and couldn't access food. And so that latter need starts to become in some people's kind of hierarchy a little bit second. And so Farmlink wanted to come in there and ease that as people sought safety and tried to mitigate the damages that were caused by either failures of an electric grid or just damage caused by something like a hurricane, which of course is closely tied to changes in the climate, as you mentioned. So it has certainly impacted Farmlink's operations, and it's a harder thing to manage because it requires a kind of place-driven placement strategy. And in general, we have supply, and then we look to local communities for need to mitigate the amount of transportation that's involved in each of our deliveries. But in a case like, let's say, Texas, we're looking for produce in an area that could just get to Texas. And also, I'm realizing that I said Hurricane Texas when I mean Hurricane Louisiana, electric grid Texas.
Yeah.
I mean no offense. I know this is recorded. I mean no offense by mixing those things up. But yeah, it's certainly on Farmlink's radar and has become increasingly frequent.
Yeah, I think it's pretty amazing how you've managed to adapt from one, as you said, one crisis to another as one becomes less in the forefront. And I'm sure that adaptability will help loads of people in the future. And then one of my last few questions is, in your capacity as a member of the Farmlink Project, or even personally, do you know anyone that has been impacted or had to move due to climate change?
I do, yes. And this is a friend of a friend, but somebody who had to move because of the forest fires in California. And, they were lucky that they had this immediate friend of mine to stay with. But I don't know, I just feel like there's kind of like a I can't believe I'm about to say this, Rolodex of like examples of like people who have had to leave because of forest fires. I mean, I had to leave, granted, this is not a migration or a moving, but was around the Lake Tahoe area when the Caldera fire was getting big and the Dixie fire was getting big. But another case a few years back in California, a friend had to, their school became a bunch of trailers in their parking lot. And so again, these aren't displacements as much as kind of inconveniences and stresses on the communities that we're managing them. But it's definitely something that I'm realizing that my reaction to it has become less surprised every time, which is upsetting.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I hope that our response doesn't become so dulled that it becomes so much less of a surprise that we don't act on it.
I agree.
And then finally, is there anything you'd like our listeners to know that we perhaps haven't covered during the course of this interview? And then lastly, could you suggest any active steps that we as Earth Refuge as an organization can take to combat the crisis of food waste and food insecurity?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I don't think that there's anything that I want to cover that we haven't said yet, aside from just asking folks to visit the Farmlink Project website. So it's farmlinkproject.org, and come and meet folks who are working on this. Everybody who works on it does so in their free time, and often while they're a student or working another job. And so the people are truly in love with the work that they're doing. And I think that, I guess maybe that's the one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, is just thank you to everybody who works at the Farmlink Project, because it has been a joy in my life and has really changed my perspective on what I want to do. And I know that that's the case for folks across Farmlink as well. But directly for Earth Refuge, some organizations have kind of organization focused, what we call power hours. And this is the hour where you come online with a Farmlink Project member and call farmers in a specific area and ask about their supply, ask if they, generate waste, and then kind of get your hands dirty with thinking about the food system, but with the other folks in your organization. So that's always an option and something that we'd love to see groups do.
Great. Yeah, that's definitely something that we will try and encourage our listeners and members of the organization to get involved with. So Jordan, that's all the questions I have for you today. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us and speak about your experience with Farmlink. I think you and your team are doing key work here in the US and in Mexico and are an inspiration, particularly to young people and college students who are wanting to promote valuable and necessary change and do the work to combat the climate crisis. Thank you again, Jordan.
Thank you very much.